Excellent. So as I said, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We are really thrilled to be welcoming Dr. Jovan Scott-Lewis in a multi-year webinar series that we have organized. And if you're interested in checking out any of the previous guest lecturers that we've had, you can go to our Twitter page or our YouTube page, or we also have a page on the Oxford geography website. I wanted to start actually with just a bit of contextual information about the Political Worlds Cluster. What we do here, we are a group of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary social scientists. So we draw membership from across the University of Oxford in the social sciences, and our cluster members conduct research broadly on politics and power, and we have an interest in how these are constituted in and across space and place. We seek to develop novel and critical understandings of the relations between geographical knowledges and regimes of discipline and violence. And you can see 4 of our kind of central cluster themes, as well as information on our Twitter profile here on this slide. And here's some of the exciting research that the cluster has sponsored over the years. So we're drawing from postcolonial, feminist, decolonial, and anti-racist work, as I've said, kind of broadly in the social sciences, but particularly with an interest and a focus on political and cultural geographies. So the event today, we are really thrilled to welcome Dr. Jovan Scott-Lewis. Dr. Scott-Lewis is Associate Professor and Chair in the Department of Geography at the University of California, Berkeley. His research is generally concerned with the questions of racial capitalism, underdevelopment, and radical terms of repair in the Caribbean and the US. He's the author of Scammers Yard, The Crime of Black Repair in Jamaica and Violent Utopia. This book traces the consequences of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, and in 2021, he was appointed by the California Governor Gavin Newsom to serve on the state's reparations task force. We're really thrilled that he has made the time to come and share some of his knowledge and insights with us this afternoon. Please do write down questions and be prepared to actively engage in the Q&A session after the talk. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Jovan.
Thank you so much, Amber. Thank you for inviting me and having me here. Patricia, thank you for taking time to provide comments after the talk, and everybody in the audience, thank you for joining us. Good morning here from Berkeley. It's lovely to be with you today. So the introduction says as much as I think needs to be said about me. So, I will kind of just move into the talk if I can, for the sake of time. So today I'll discuss how a group of young Jamaicans sought to navigate a life of hardship formed within the overlapping wakes of colonial independence and structural adjustment. Each of these equally weighted and enduring moments delimited the scope and scale of opportunity for them and many other poor, urban, and Black Jamaicans. This sense comes from the experiences of 3 friends, who I call Omar, Jr., and Dwayne, who participated in the Jamaican lottery scam in an effort to mitigate these circumstances. The scam is an intricate scheme that defrauds thousands of primarily elderly white Americans to send scammers like this crew that I worked with in Jamaica what often amounted to their life savings. The Scammer Show demonstrates the mechanisms by which this crew of young scammers was able to refashion themselves and their country and the broader global relations within which both are set. These scammers understood that the world as it exists was not meant for them. So they drew on novel logics of capital, criminality, and Blackness as a formula for post-colonial Black repair to make a world for themselves and on their terms. The impetus behind this process was straightforward. Omar, Junior, and Dwayne were young, poor, and Black, and they wanted money. Money that was lasting, impactful, and meaningful. In other words, they wanted money so that they could make life, as they would say, in their city of Montego Bay. They had lived much too long without it, and that life was one that they no longer wished to endure. It was a life of sufferation, a Jamaican term that I would define as being an inescapable condition of chronic poverty that is foundational to life's experience and comprises life's very quality. That money could equate to life was not a remarkable fact to them. Money had always set life's tone. It was as if they intrinsically understood the intimate relationship between Black life and economic value. When they had money, everything was nice, even blessed. But its absence bred misery, frustration, and vexation, if not damnation. The days they lacked money outnumbered the days they had it. Those broke pocket days were the norm. Indeed, this accounting was what conditioned their life in their community that I call Elizabeth Commons, a low-income housing development scheme built through the Urban Development Corporation in the early 1980s. In Jamaica, residential communities, especially those that share common facilities, are considered to live in a yard, right? The yard can and often does extend to the entire neighborhood, expanding as far as one's limits of belonging. In schemes like Elizabeth Commons, where rows of thousands of houses form a labyrinthine urban network of homes, the spaces between the rows, or what are also called the lanes, take on a very similar metonymic quality. Yards serve as central sites of Jamaican social life and represent a particular geography of shared fate and of communal striving. In the same definitional spirit, yard is a common and affectionate colloquial name for Jamaica, the country, the home, the phenomenon, especially as it exists and circulates in the diaspora, with the infamous figure of the yardie being born on Britain's shores. On this basis, my book, Scammer's Yard, is thus titled to indicate how Jamaica was changed and impacted by the scam, but also, and most importantly, how the scam allowed the country for these young men to become a space of inclusion, especially for those who found themselves long outside the circuit of opportunity, those who Sylvia Winter would call the totally deselected. In other words, where the seeking of opportunity had long caused Jamaicans to long for and pursue and elsewhere, the scam permitted those who took up the practice to remain. Elizabeth Commons was a neighborhood of yards in the sense that they shared the hardships and struggles and celebrated the joys and pride of their community. My analysis of this geography is concerned with the confluence of poverty and aspiration and the autonomy that it generates. That autonomy serves as immaterial motivation behind the everyday ethics and logic of the urban life of poverty for Jamaicans like the residents of Elizabeth Commons. In pursuing this analysis, by examining the power of aspiring for life without want, or simply for a chance to make decent money, I get at how the crew would ultimately aspire and accomplish their pursuit of making life. Before forming their scamming crew, the three friends had long struggled to make life as they envisioned it. They had each been intermittently involved in one occupation or another, but the work they found, or that found them, as they put it, was primarily casual. Tabulating the litany of jobs that each recited having after leaving school several years prior, it was understandable that Junior, Dwayne, and Omar claimed to have exhausted, but more importantly, have become exhausted by the available opportunities for work in their city. I remember reading the exhaustion in their bodies and in their bodies' languages, both of which were repositories for hardships that were less acute and just simply structural. Junior's, Dwayne's, and Omar's need to earn was intensified by each of them having to live with their families. Junior and Omar, who had children with their girlfriends, bore a heavier burden by living between their family homes and their partners' families. Both noted in these environments constant inquiries by these family members into how much they were earning and why they could not pay a variety of bills. As Junior put it, there was always a question of when is that going to be paid? When is that going to be paid? What's happening? Right? So failure in this regard risked the dreaded assignation of being termed whatless or worthless, a charge that cut deep into the anxieties and insecurities of masculinist ideals and expectations of financial caretaking and overall productivity. Whatlessness is not simply a contemporary understanding of Black value, but goes back to early ideations following emancipation in Jamaica. From analyses by Marx and Du Bois, and more recently by literary historian Christopher Taylor, we know that the devastating outcome of emancipation was that it caused the bodies of ex-slaves to become effectively worthless. The creation of worthlessness and the economic convenience of emancipation set the foundation for the qualification of Jamaica's political economy. The relationship between labor and human value was formed from this moment, positioning emancipatory worthlessness as a contemporary whatlessness that the crew and many poor yet striving young Jamaicans experience. Such was the cost of freedom, the devaluing of one's labor, one's power to produce. It is no coincidence then that so much of the gendered presentation among Jamaican men, as noted in the literature and expressed by the crew, can be understood as securing value through economic productivity. What was worse than not working and being whatless was working and still being criticized for being a poor earner. At least in the former scenario, men could always say that they were working on something. In other words, a promise was better than a proven failure. Whatlessness did more than motivate them and provide a framework for understanding their world. It also made clear their economic limits and their social consequences. They were meant to produce, however, their environments had proved fruitless. How much more failure could they carry? And to what extent could they resist feelings of deficiency? Ultimately, what could they do? So for Junior, Omar, and Dwayne, their answer was to turn to crime. The crew hustled by using purchased contact lists and internet calling. They convinced mostly elderly and white North Americans to send them tens of thousands of US dollars. Forming their scammer crew, Dwayne, Omar, and Junior ran an advanced fee scam that, through phone solicitation, deceives these Americans into wiring money to them in Jamaica through the financial service companies Western Union and MoneyGram. The lottery scam, as its name suggests, is presented as if victims have won a prize of money, a car, or a combination of awards, and is thus a classic form of advanced fee scam, which the FBI defines as schemes in which the perpetrator informs a victim that the victim has qualified for a large financial loan or has won a large financial award, but must first pay the perpetrator taxes or fees in order to access the loan or award. The victim pays the advance fee, but never receives the promised money. Junior's crew got victim information from what are called lead lists, which are compiled lists of identity data assembled by brokers based in Jamaica and the United States. The leads are purchased from various sources, such as online data repositories, like here in the US, Spokio.com, or legitimate telemarketing and sales lead companies. Brokers also collect information on potential victims by sending out sweepstakes entry solicitations that require various kinds of personal information, such as name, age, address, and whether one has a credit card. While scam victims are targeted using a variety of scenarios, Junior's crew claimed that potential victim had a credit card account error, often a miscalculation of their card's annualized percentage rate, or APR, with an offer to remedy the error. The victims are asked to pay taxes and transfer fees on the returned interest. The frequency with which these fees are requested increases inevitably, leading victims to spend in the thousands to tens of thousands of dollars to collect the originally promised sum. The scam is thought to have its origins in Montego Bay's rapidly developing call center industry. Jamaica sought to create an incentive-driven and geographically competitive knowledge-based economy through investment in nearshore business process outsourcing, or BPO, which effectively meant call centers, by becoming the first nation in the Anglophone Caribbean to liberalize the telecommunications industry in 2003. Ironically, the same infrastructure that enabled Jamaica to grow to a nearshore outsourcing destination for the dozens of companies that take advantage of the tax-free commercial zone also helped scamming flourish. Jamaica's liberalization of the telecommunications industry, which made the internet increasingly available, fast, and reliable, for Jamaica's citizens would result in tens of thousands of scam calls over the following several years. The scam's use of ICT represented a breach in the typically opaque operation of first world capitalism. Globalization and liberalization had created a landscape where the poor, especially in the developing world, are often thought of as being outright excluded or incapable of accessing what they offer. Indeed, late capitalist economies were new frontier spaces for opportunistic circuits, through whose cracks marginalized people, even whole regions, could fall. However, the practice illustrated the accessibility and vulnerability, in fact, of the ICT-driven development model, especially as it is enacted in spaces like special economic zones. So scamming allowed entry into not only the local Jamaican economy, but also global circuits of capital. By scamming, Junior, Omar, and Dwayne expanded beyond the limits of culture and sport that typically qualify as registers of Jamaican capability. Through telephone scamming and the seizing of capital, the crew became convinced of their value, their talents, and their capabilities as participants in the domains of capital and technology, from which they were often thought to not be a part. Subsequently, they felt they could approach power directly and practice a kind of freedom. Indeed, living and struggling within the various scales of underdevelopment that determine their circumstances, the crew mobilized a moral framework of repair to justify or at least make sense of not just their participation in the scam, but of the disposition of the world that would require that they scam in the first place. Largely inspired by a then current and popular song by dancehall artist Vybz Kartel, the crew's reparative justification was very obviously convenient, but there was an undeniable quality and power to the rationale they articulated. Critically, I was following Deborah Thomas's urging that we use reparations as a framework for thinking in taking their claims seriously. Thomas argues that doing so allows us to recognize the interplay of geopolitical scales and history and compels us to refocus our notions of citizenship, sovereignty, and accountability. For the crew, the reparations they claimed from their victims had very little to do with the normative terms on which reparations are typically based. Rather than being situated within an argument about slavery, reparations were explicitly a matter of contemporary concern. The contemporary poverty that they experienced and used the scam to escape was more meaningful and identifiable than the injury of slavery. As a result, the scam's reparatory formulary mobilized a reparative logic capable of reformulating the sites and perpetrators of post-colonial transgression in a manner that stretched and bent the conventional history of colonial exploitation, in which North Americans could in fact pay the reparative debts earned by centuries of British slavery and colonialism. When answering my question of how they could think that scamming, how they could think that scamming, was a form of reparations, one member of the crew replied in turn with a question: aren't they the same white people? I had asked him not only if scamming could be a form of reparations, but how could they scam North Americans when they were sitting within the wake of British colonialism? So joining the reconfiguring of time as a reparative marker, this crew member had brought up something unexpected but unmistakable. Indeed, these two types of people were likely the same kind of whites if we overgeneralize the Anglo influence in the United States formation. But I still thought that they had to be different because of their colonial past. But by lumping both the British and Americans together, the crew member engaged in a semiotic maneuvering that accounted for a long history of Jamaican experience where the British and then the Americans function in the same capacity. In practical terms, and to say nothing of the high-level geopolitics historically at play, if the British once had Jamaicans work the plantations, the Americans now have them work hotels and call centers that trap them in cycles of poverty that are effectively indistinguishable from this history of colonial impoverishment. And so using ICT, the crew radically redefined the normative geographic delimitations of reparative blame. In other words, there was not just one guilty party, it was every party that participated and then benefited in any way from their current poverty and the system that produced it. The rationale is a demonstration of what Obika Gray calls a disjuncture between the misery and hardships of Jamaicans' lived experience and the imagined experience of participating in the material well-being of America. The scam and its reparative rationale uncovered the true interconnected crime of Western development. So the crew's choice to materialize their ambitions through a con is appropriate given their read of the world. To Junior, Omar, and Dwayne, the world they live in is bent and unyielding, marked and marred by political and economic structures that have long plagued Jamaica's development and that still haunt the nation through the specter of structural adjustment. Navigating contemporary Jamaica required them to look at the world askance and to maneuver within it accordingly. Their lives are situated within the post-colonial condition of Blackness, but framed by the post-structural adjustment period, or what might be termed as North Atlantic developed nations' contemporary experience of late liberalism. When Jamaica received independence from Great Britain in 1962, the country was part of the wave of burgeoning experiments of post-colonial sovereignty. Although Jamaica is now nearly 60 years into its independence, the project of nation building has yet to be fully realized, due in large part to the terms of the IMF lending agreements that have trapped the country in a crisis of national indebtedness. To service their debt, Caribbean governments like Jamaica's, typically have to cut spending on public services and other government expenditures, and they remove measures that provide market assistance to their citizens. The demands that neoliberal economic policies place on governments are satisfied by reducing or altogether eliminating support for and by making greater demands of their citizens, resulting in an increasing reliance on grassroots practice for political and economic development. For the crew, their poverty was a crime, not the scam. Moreover, that crime was not produced by their criminality, nor by some Jamaican pathology, but due to how modern capitalism functions in the region. The outcome of their trying so many different ways to make a living suggested that there was something else, something more to be seen and understood to attain success beyond the hustling and the suffering. It was an astute intuitional assessment. Thus, they required a new politics of vigilance, of a new way of seeing. For the crew, all meaningful opportunities to raise themselves from poverty had proven fruitless. This was a fruitlessness that they, having grown cynical, even dismissive of the promise of education and citizenship, applied to the broader promise of Jamaican independence, from which they were now a generation removed. They were not raised on the hope of increased political and economic prospects, symbolized by the failed Union Jack in 1962, but on the evaporation of that hope amidst the fulfillment of structural adjustment that began just over a decade later. This notion, if not fact of failure, fits centrally into their calculations of the world and their country's place within it. David Scott qualifies such failure as a tragedy of colonial enlightenment that transgresses the now conventional romance of revolutionary overcoming and offers us the elements of a critical story of our post-colonial time. Using the genre tenses of historical narrative, Scott writes that teleologies of romance largely framed thinking for and about the period leading up to Jamaican independence. Thus, to recast the problem of the colonial past to rectify the colonial present requires, he says, focusing our attention on the paradoxical inscriptions of pasts within the present, on the persistence of contingencies within freedom, on the intransigence of failure within success. In doing so, Scott argues that we would find that tragedy may help us better than romance to cope with so unyielding a post-colonial present as our own. Analyzing the post-colonial present as historical narrative, as Scott does, helps define the moment in which the crew lives and helps identify how they understand that world. Scott's tragedy does much of the work in explaining this world, one that's less optimistic given the shortened horizon of liberationist possibility, one marked by failure at both the level of the state project and of the individual subject. However, the scam demands and even offers a reading beyond the tragic. Following Scott, I argue that the present that the scammers confront is actually reconciled through the notion of satire. Satire signals a conviction that the world has grown old. Furthermore, satire presupposes the ultimate inadequacy of the visions of the world, dramatically represented in the genres of romance and tragedy alike. Relatedly, Scott argues that tragedy comports better with a time of post-colonial crisis in which old horizons have collapsed or evaporated and new ones have not yet taken shape. But it is the ultimate inadequacy of the satirical mode that allows for the comprehending of life in the Caribbean in the period following not only the collapse of the Bandung experiments, as Scott calls them, but also the failure of incorporation on the terms of structural adjustment. The result is the failed realization of the economic justice and social equity envisioned at Jamaica's independence, and of the alternative promises of individual prosperity that followed. And thus it is with satirical praxis that scammers can mimic US bank employees offering reduction of APR fees and other characters of Western capital. In offering a narrative critique against a post-colonial present through satire, scamming advances the disutility of previous post-emancipation ethical forms developed as a complex repertoire for colonial and early post-colonial coping and broadly understood Caribbean subjectivity. Those strategies, underpinned by the emancipatory ethics of cooperation, rights, and sovereignty, have their bases in the major ideological thrusts that shape the post-colonial religious and social formations of and responses to life in Jamaica from abolition up to independence. But neither the social mores that produce the values of freedom and emancipation, nor the principle of nationalism in the era of independence secured Junior, Omar, and Dwayne's vision of what a sovereign post-colonial future could be. Indeed, with the turn away from the values of social welfare, which beginning in the 1930s propelled Jamaica toward independence, and the turn toward a new ethical regime disciplined by US and IMF-induced privatization, that possibility faded with the ascendance of the new post-colonial ethics in Jamaica beginning in the 1980s. This is the era of the overlapping wakes of post-coloniality as failed independence and structural adjustment. These young men all came of age when the hue of post-colonial social orientation had shifted radically. So fleeting was the actual moment of post-colonial independence. And thus they sought a kind of freedom, albeit not from colonialism, but of the poverty left in its wake. These young men used the framework of their time, their formation, that of structural adjustment by way of the industries that it produced, to liberate themselves. Just as a generation before them had sought freedom based on the scaffolding of their time, that of modern state-based nationalism, this generation of young Jamaicans chose to glean their independence by criminal means. Gone was the collectivist ethos that had long contained the hope of the independence era. Junior, Omar, and Dwayne's participation in the scam was a critique of, even a resistance to, the hardship caused by local development processes. Thinking through the political and economic circumstances of the structural adjustment era in Jamaica, of deepening debt and decreasing prospects abroad, this framing is taken to its extreme through the scammer ethic of seizure. Responding to these circumstances with what I would term a turn toward post-colonial seizure or reparative seizure, the crew subverts the poverty that serves as the ethical foundation of the post-colonial present. The ethics of seizure, satire, or the scam respond to what the crew see as the shape of the world in which they live. Thus, the contours of the space of Jamaica, once occupied by visions of sovereignty and emancipation before it, were now otherwise characterized. And thus, through seizure, scammers exploit the locals' long engagement with the global, where seizure finds its ethical virtue in the claims of the poor. Therefore, in the failed realization of independence's promise, the paradoxical ethics of impoverishment and consumptive desire is a product of Jamaicans' contemporary take on their country's position in the global political economy. Independence in this era, thus, is monetary. Therefore, the absence of wealth and movement, both remaining perpetually elusive and thus furnishing the conditions for misery and immobility, translates a fundamental condition that is in need of repair. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Brilliant. And I hope that we have a lot of questions and comments and insights from our audience members. So just a brief reminder, and then also for those of you who may have joined us slightly late today, that we are recording this, but we do hope that the exchange is slightly more intimate. So following Professor Daly's discussion points, I'm going to open up to the audience for questions. And if you would like to, then you're very welcome to turn on your camera and your microphone and voice the question directly. Otherwise, please do use the chat function to pose questions for Dr. Lewis. So it's a great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Patricia Daly, who is joining us today to provide some initial provocations and commentary on this excellent paper. Patricia is a Jamaican-born British human geographer and academic specializing in forced migration, political ecology, and geographies of Africa. She is Professor of Human Geography of Africa at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of Jesus College, Oxford. Patricia, thank you so much for your time, and I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Amber, and thank you, Jovan, for an amazing presentation. You've introduced so many things that I would like to talk about, but I noticed that there are a number of specialists on Jamaica in the audience, so I'm going to leave some of the more specifics to them. But I just want to, I work on Africa, and the issue around scammers, right, is something that's been occupying you could say security people, some scholars in relation to African study, who work on Africa. And in Nigeria, we had the 491 scammers linked to emails. We have romance scammers now, and I wonder. I think you've perfectly sort of situated the development of this type of activity within the effects of neoliberal globalization. Right? So Jamaica, in a sense, is not that dissimilar. What is happening in Jamaica is not that dissimilar from what is happening elsewhere in Africa. And recently, I've been watching films on Netflix about scamming, and I'm thinking, actually, this process, right, is growing. And this way of, and there might be something deeper as well. And in ways in which we can understand this. And I liked your mention of the neoliberal subjectivities, because this is all about self-promotion. In some sense, what they're doing is entrepreneurial work in the way in which they've been encouraged to do as neoliberal subjects, right? Where their self-worth is linked to how much they can accumulate individually through wealth. And that this is, of course, development in technology. Now, it's not email now, it's phones, it's the use of call center, all these technological shifts. It could be Tinder, the other people have refashioned themselves and create new identities through which they can use to accumulate wealth. So I see it as a new form of wealth generation, even though it's been criminalized. And in some sense, people are not necessarily, are not criticizing or reading these practices as illegal activities. They're almost activities that these young people have to get involved in because of their lack of access to employment, lack of resources. And this is the only solution in the context of the strictures of structural adjustment that have been imposed. But I also thought about, when you were speaking, about the relationship, if we see as a new sort of practice of accumulation, right? I was thinking about the relationship that, say, traditional would happen, say, in the traditional workplace or factory, where you can see the boss, you have some sort of relationship with the boss, and actually getting that surplus or higher wages from the boss is virtually impossible. It involves negotiations, right? And so in some sense, in this context, what you have is individuals, right, not actually attacking the state or, and they've been told to ignore, the state is not going to provide for them. So they're targeting other individuals. So it's about one neoliberal, it's one subject, neoliberal subject, actually engaging with another who has aspirations as well of wealth. And you know, scamming each other or trying to. So, you know, I just thought it was, in fact, it then becomes a very intimate form of exchange, even though they're distant, right? Because it's, you know, you build up a relationship with a person, an effective relationship before you scam them, right? So I see it as, in some sense, as, and that happens whether they're romance scammers or whether they're email scammers. You know, either I'm suffering, I need, you know, I want to get this money out of the country and so on. So you know, I'm interested in seeing it in that way. And if we're talking, if we're using the term reparations, then it makes sense, because we're getting, it's about reparations. You know, we are now expected to see each other as individuals rather than see each other as being part of communities or part of states that have responsibility. So why not get reparations from, you know, another? You know, I'm not going to say much more, but I just, you know, you know, in what was interesting was in West Africa, it seems to be a lot of the young men are also quite well educated. They're unemployed graduates, people who can't find work, even, you know, because of the liberalization of the university sector or the higher education sector. And I wonder whether, you know, you said these people are not, in Jamaica, these young men are the ones who can't leave. So is it because, and they're, you know, they're not, probably haven't finished secondary education or have only finished secondary education. Do the unemployed graduates leave and so they don't participate in this type of activities? Are they, or why is it this group from a yard rather than, you know, more sophisticated, you know, or perhaps these groups are sophisticated enough and, you know, others have other opportunities.
Right.
So I'm going to stop there and then open it up, because for the Jamaican specialist on, in the audience to ask questions.
Got it. Thank you so much for that, Patricia. And okay, so I'm glad that at least the paper made sense. You confirmed that I think it makes sense at least, right? So, all right. You know, so you've brought up like all of the issues that I address, you know, at length in the book. And you know, what I would say, you know, starting with the question of reparations, you know, what I would say to that is, you know, I found the reparative claim of the scammers quite sophisticated, because, you know, they were able to make, you know, through their innovation, an intervention in practical reparations that formal, you know, reparations groups and organizations have never been able to. In other words, you know, groups like the CARICOM Reparations Commission, various other groups. I'm a part of a thing here in California. You know, we and, you know, these other groups like us are targeting the state, right? The state who has both the power, you know, the wherewithal generally in terms of actual capital and political power to resist any claims, right? Because the system is set in a way where even if the state denies, you know, these reparations groups, you know, what they're seeking, you know, the state relations is still there, where these groups, or at least its members, cannot live outside the state. And so what you have is a reparative process in which the state, or in which, you know, former colonial powers are in fact setting the terms of what reparations will be, right? You may ask for something, but we, you know, good and well, you won't actually get what you ask for. You may get something, but you won't get what you ask for. And so through what I call in the book, the kind of fungibility of whiteness, the scammers are saying, well, to our mind, there's no difference between a North American white and a British white. Moreover, there's no difference between an individual white person and the state that is white and represents them. So in other words, the state, the white state, and the white individual, you know, are both complicit in what they would regard as the kind of long arc of impoverishment, you know, of Black Jamaicans. In other words, you know, and it's important that this practice emerges out of Montego Bay, where you have both the kind of rise of the call center industry in the country, but also this longer history of tourism, right? With Mobe being the kind of like epicenter of the tourist economy in the country. So there is this long-standing familiarity with the wealth that whites have, especially those who are coming from North America. And And so there's this accessibility, this recognition, right? That in fact, well, if they represent the state, here they are, their capital is more accessible. Let's approach them, right? And so, you know, it's convenient in all kinds of ways, but it still actually gets the job done at the end of the day. And so, you know, to my mind, you know, it is about what becomes possible, as you put it, you know, with this development of a kind of, you know, what we might think of as neoliberal relations, right? Which we can actually, you know, we have been forced out of state relations in a way, right? We have to move into relations with private corporations and with individuals. And so all of the ethical forms, right, you know, necessarily follow suit. And so, you know, which is why in the talk today, I said, you know, they've given up on the sovereign project. It's satirical. It's a satirical approach, right? They aren't invested in politics, right? The extent to which politics can be productive, fine, but there is no actual investment in terms of how they, you know, develop what they might consider their self-qualification. And so, you know, they see this, you know, across the board. And so what's interesting is that when the call centers began in Jamaica, they really were developed with, you know, Jamaican working class in mind. That was the kind of labor pool that was targeted. And so, you know, people like the scamming crew, right, who didn't have, you know, more than secondary education, were able to access those jobs. But what happened, because of the kind of, you know, limits of the Jamaican economy, the call center increasingly became, you know, populated by people who were coming out with their degrees from the University of the West Indies. And so, you know, what you have was a shift where even the working class or poor Jamaicans who, you know, several years prior could get a job at the call center, they were now competing with people with actual university degrees. And so the thing was that they had already learned these skills in the call center. And so as they were pushed out of the call center through competition, they mobilized those skills, right, in the same way. And, you know, it's important to note that, you know, the average wage for a call center worker in Jamaica at the time was, you know, a US dollar per hour, right? Yet, by the same token, you know, in the year of my field work, scamming brought in $300 million US into the Jamaican economy, right? And so what's so fascinating and which proves, in fact, the kind of theory of the scammers is that there's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with their capability, right? Because here they are outside of the formal call center industry, generating money for the Jamaican economy. Yet within the formal industry, the sums are paltry, right? So yeah, so there's a lot that you bring up. You know, the 419 scam, the Sakawa scam that comes out of Ghana, the romance scam. You know, they all are a part of, you know, this ability to you know, mobilize, especially internet technologies, for the purpose, right, of seeking, you know, resource, seeking capital in these broader global circuits. You know, there are some distinctions between these scams, but you're right, they do form, you know, what we can argue is part of the bedrock of, you know, of contemporary capitalism, right? If you think about what tech startups, you know, and tech founders have to do in order to, you know, pitch their product, that is, you know, that we all know have become accepted to not be profitable for the first several years of their existence, right? So that is already, you know, a kind of breach of what we might think of as a normative terms of capitalist accumulation. You're not actually accumulating anything. So, you know, what we see is that capitalism writ large in this moment is largely just a scam, right? And so the scammers are participating in that practice. They recognize that that's what you have to do, because there are people like Junior who would say to me, you know, look at me. I'm a youth with intelligence. I know I can produce. I know I can work. Yet here I am, left to the margins. You know, and so therefore this notion of illegal activity, you know, there's a general read of criminality in the landscape of what we might think of as normative and sanctioned capitalism, right? And so the scammers have simply become honest about what it takes to actually earn. Because they know that when a call center shows up in Jamaica, it is criminal for them to be making just $1 an hour, because they know how much the products on the other end of that phone call cost. they know, right, what the incomes of the North American clients on the other end of that phone call make. They now know exactly how, you know, Western capitalism works. They are no longer hidden from it behind or on the other side of the wall of the all-inclusive, right? And so, you know, and so they realize it now. And so they pursue it unabashedly. And I think, you know, with great sophistication and honesty. And so what they demand is that we actually read the world more generally as, you know, existing within the kind of circuit of criminality. And, you know, and that's the argument.
Thanks. Are there, if there are no questions, are there questions from the audience or any hands up, Amber?
Yes. Jelani, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Thank you. I'm a Jamaican PhD student. Patricia is my supervisor. No expert, but I care about the place, and my research is centered on Jamaica. Thanks for the presentation, Jovan. I remember coincidentally seeing this come up as a working paper when I was an undergrad student in the Bay Area. And so it's sort of a full circle moment to actually finally engage with the work. I have found quite compelling the rationale for why it is that these individuals who you rightly say are sort of neoliberal subjects decide on a form of seizure that is individual, if not peer-to-peer. And how it is that that is then located with as a contemporary form within a longer tradition of seizure. Which I think is important, because the idea of what we consider scamming, i.e. that you have managed to access or accumulate something which was not explicitly intended for you, normally by somebody else, with a greater sense of power structurally, is important. The part that I still have a different here. In other words, to what degree can a neoliberal seizure actually produce repair if there are boundaries or you know, if there's limitation towards what it is that any neoliberal ethic of repair could actually repair, one. And also that the ways in which scamming and the material accumulation happens means that there are, you know, very close sort of geographies of extraction that happen locally to other people who are similarly disenfranchised. In other words, that it's closely related to criminal activity that is not actually directed outside of one's immediate community, that they don't necessarily demonstrate transformed opportunities for persons outside of them, that it create sub-economies of violence that I don't think actually are structurally transformative, but are individually harmful to the people around them. And so it is legitimate, certainly to me, to see how it is that somebody might say, having been, as you put it, outside the circuits of opportunity, I would like to participate, and in some sense, owe it to myself, knowing my own sense of worth, both intrinsically and within a global political economy, but less convinced about actually what that means for even other people who are outside of that circuit of opportunity, but not exactly opting for the same mode of seizure. I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you for that, Jelani.
Amber, should we take another question before?
Thanks, Patricia.
Because
Yeah.
we've only got much time. Yeah.
Simone, would you like to ask your question, please? And then Odera, we'll take 3.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay, Jovan. Hey, thank you for the presentation. It was very insightful. You touched on so many interesting points. My hand is sore. I'm writing so much. I'm very curious, actually, about the methodology of the research.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, how did you get in contact with these people? How was your experience also, you know, in getting close to them, and how did you live your experience as a researcher while being, I think, close to them, you know? So how you also lived this, if there was struggles, maybe, how was your positionality?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, a bit about this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Simone.
Thanks. Odera, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm coming in from the point of view of a Nigerian, so I don't know if I'm sort of sharing the same background as other people in the group. And also, I'm really sorry I came late. I had like a work shift. But I wanted to ask to what extent your research also sort of touches on this experience of sort of getting by and waithood. And I'm talking from the experience of, like I said, an African, you know, talking about how youths on the African continent sort of have to hustle and get by, you know, because they are working in situations of weak state institutions and lack of employment. And, you know, because of these lack of employment, they can't necessarily access some of the signifiers of adulthood. So buying a car, buying a house, etc. So within the African literature, they came up with this whole context of like waithood, how you'd have to like hustle and get by. But this is within the context of like informal economy. So doing sort of ragtag work just to get by. But this is a bit different. This is a bit like explicit. This is scamming. This is, you know, taking essentially what doesn't belong to you, I guess. So I wanted to ask how this sort of deals, sort of interrogates that literature. And then it's also very interesting too how this is seen from the context of like reparation. So you took from us and we want to take back from you. And again, I want to see to what extent this also relates to scamming on the African continent, at least West Africa, so Nigeria and Ghana. Because in the Nigerian context, I don't think it's necessarily seen as reparation. There was even a song that came out when like 12 years ago, and the song was in Pidgin, but I can translate it to English for you. It's like, dear white man, I would take your money. 419 or scamming is just a game and you're the loser and I'm the winner. So it's literally like it's a game, it's a ploy, it's a tool. And I just want to take from you as much as I can before I get caught. So I want to, if you have, you know, done some reading or research with scamming on the African continent, I want to see how, you know, there's been some points of intersection and some other points of difference.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Wonderful.
There's also just a comment in the chat quickly from Erica, who is raising the issue of perhaps how much the scammers know who they're scamming. And so Erica says it's a bit like the scamming some Jamaicans do to their family who live abroad, taking reparations, if enough, not freely given.
Got it.
If it's okay just to like to fill that out, I think there's been a kind of like a long history of I can only speak from the position of Jamaicans because, you know, my parents are Jamaicans, and I remember relatives coming up with mysterious illnesses and other things that they need to send money you know, immediately for, and those relatives don't necessarily even acknowledge if the money's arrived or not. We just don't hear from them for a good while. And I'm just wondering whether the scamming started off with scamming your family. So the people who came from Jamaica to the UK, for example, that's where I live. But then the next generation or the generation after that, we don't actually know the people in Jamaica. So there's no allegiance to them. So therefore the scamming needs to then go wider to complete strangers or another mechanism for the scamming needs to happen, because even some of the generations that did come over to the UK, they've died now. Yeah, so they're no longer a source of economy. So a bit of a kind of like a question, what's your thoughts on that? Is there some mileage in that? And also a bit of an observation. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Sure. Amber, please tell me I have more than 3 minutes to answer these questions.
I think we will say 5 minutes and then we will come to
5 minutes, okay. 5 minutes and the Zoom turns into a pumpkin. I got it. All right. So, all right, well, these questions deserve, you know, another visit or something, I think. But, you know, what I will say in response to Jelani's questions, right, is that you know, when I talk about satire, when I talk about this turn away from the previously existing ethics, where's Jelani? Is Jelani gone? I like to look at it. Okay, there you are. Let me just pin you here quickly so I can look at you. Okay. there's a different sociality that develops as a result, right? So when I say that they are when I say that they are informed by the ethics of structural adjustment, what I'm saying is that the actual orientation around Jamaican sociality has been impacted by that. So we can see over the various thrusts that I briefly mentioned, what it means to be Jamaican at the period of emancipation, Jamaican at that time, what it means to be Jamaican, especially at the period of independence, right? Both of these represent a very collectivist, right, ethos, right? Because the ethical conjunctures of emancipation and independence demand collectivism. However, in the context of the wake of structural adjustment, so in other words, I'm trying to say structural adjustment is as important to understanding the composition of Jamaican ethics as the period of independence, as a period of emancipation. So I would say that these are the three points of the kind of long arc of Jamaican political and ethical development. And so what does it actually mean to be Jamaican in the kind of wake of structural adjustment? When you know that you no longer have, right, the kind of promise of state support. What you have is a growing individualism, which we talked about. And so how I kind of, illustrate that is that the returns from the scam, right? The money, here are people who were earning little to nothing to all of a sudden bringing in 5,000 US a month. So the question is, what would happen with that amount, of money a generation before, right? Well, what happened with this, with this community or with this crew of scammers was, and you see this with scammers more generally, is they move out of their neighborhoods. They go and they buy some land. They go build that 3-story house, right? They go and they buy the Audi. They go do these things, right? The scammers in the crew that I worked with, they went and they put their kids in private school. They did all of these things. So what you saw was actually an extraction, a removal from the community, right? And so the ethics have changed. And so the repair that you ask about also ends up being individualist in this way, right? Because the injuries are no longer recognized as these collective injuries, right? It's no longer the injury of the collective, enslaved population. It is the injury that I feel personally as a Black Jamaican, right? And so the reparation can similarly be, produced and provided individually. And then I exercise my reparation on individual terms. So what we're talking about is, you have Val Carnegie, right? And you have other Jamaican anthropologists and other people who talk about, the formation of racial formation in the plantation era, who say that, the struggle, the suffering of the plantation experience created this notion of collectivism, right? What Val Carnegie calls ethnic connectedness. Now we see that reparations, in fact, has a potential to explode that. What does it mean? What are my attachments? What are my affiliations? What are required of these things if I can actually do for myself? So we're talking about the opposite of throwing partner, right? Because to throw partner comes out of a particular moment, a particular ethical sensibility of Caribbean and Jamaican life more particularly. However, the scam represents a departure from that. And so then, you're basically asking me, the second question is about the crime and the violence from the scam, right? And how how am I reconciling, these alternative or secondary circuits, of the consequence of the scam? That's a slightly more complicated answer, because what we know is that for the first several years of the scam, right? So we're talking about from 2007 up until about 2013, there was very little incidence of scam-related violence, right? What we know, and I scoured all of the papers, right? And did a textual analysis of all of the Jamaican papers to actually see what the accounts of crime related to scam as being reported were during that period. Very few, right? I would say almost non-existent. But what you see is that from 2013 to the present, you have this rapid uptick. Well, reason being is that, and this kind of answers Simone's question, is that during the period that I was in the field, right, which was 2011 to 2013, the scam technically was not necessarily an illegal practice according to Jamaican law, right? So the Proceeds of Crime Act did not necessarily penalize people for scamming. The only thing that could be done was if you were thought to have some kind of unlawful possession or something like that, they could repossess whatever you had. So if you couldn't prove how you got the car, and there was some paraphernalia related to the scam, your car would be taken. You might be jailed for the night, but you were put out on the street the next day, right? And so that, to answer Simone's question, was how I was able to kind of access these guys, because it wasn't a problem, right? People were scamming in the street, you know, because they were using a mobile phone to call people. It was an accessible and a perceptible practice. To kind of answer Simone's question quickly. And as a Jamaican, I was able to, and as a Montagonian, because I'm from Montego Bay, I was able to, you know, position myself as being relatable, and it gave me access. But to return, right, to Jelani's question, after 2013, the United States government came down, the Jamaica government said, you need to fix this problem, right? So Elizabeth Warren and other people in the United States Senate Committee on Aging initiated this clampdown from the US government to the Jamaican government. And so what you saw was what they targeted first was this market of lead lists. And so you could no longer access the names of victims as easily as you could before, or possible victims. And so what began to happen was this kind of, you know, market scarcity, where people act, in fact, as they had in other previous economic, you know, moments, turned to violence, right? And so the violence began to increase, largely because of the state and the United States, right, response to the scam. So they clamped down on, you know, on the scam, which created this market scarcity, which scammers turned, you know, to violence as a result to try and get access to lead lists. If they couldn't get access to lead lists, they would then target other scammers who were still able to produce, right, and earn capital. The other thing that happened was that your formal organized gangs in Jamaica began to enter into the scam practice as well, because it was much easier than running drugs and running guns. And so for the first, let's say, few years of the scam, what you did not have was this large presence of organized crime involved with the scam, but that slowly increased. And so what those organized gangs brought was their already existing patterns and practices of violence into the scam. So these two things developed what we might think of as a kind of emergence of violence in the scam. And this all kind of comes to a head around 2013, when you begin to see movements to extradite scammers to the US, when you start seeing the local authorities, you know, increase their surveillance and targeting of scamming operations. Okay, Lord, Amber, all right. So, you know, so the last two questions, you know, are related actually. So this question about, you know, the kind of hustle, like the getting by thing, is that this is what Jamaicans have always done, right? You know, we call it juggling, we call it hustling, right? You know, that has been a thing. The difference is that, you know, what does it mean to live in the shadow of the United States? What does it mean to be in, especially in, you know, the North Coast of Jamaica, right, where you are constantly being inundated with the wealth, you know, of the United States? And so the idea of just getting by, right, is, you know, is two things. One, what you have is this regional influence, right? I mentioned that reference by Obika Gray about living within a disjuncture of the material well-being of America, right? And its limits in Jamaica. So there's something slightly greater there of a direct necessity that drives, let's call it what Deborah Thomas calls the kind of desire for a conspicuous consumption, right? Now, moreover, what you have is, again, as I said earlier, you have this shifting ethics, right? Where it's no longer seen as appropriate, you know, to do that Christian duty, right? This Protestant ethic, as it were, of working hard to get ahead, because these young men know that there are no dividends on the other end of that investment, right? And so they move away from that. And so it is a game, right? So like the 419, you know, it is a game, and they are, you know, but the read is not that the game is somehow, you know, a deviation. They understand that the entire operation of capitalism is a game, because they're living within it, because they constantly are the losers in it, because they can see it, it's perceptible. And so, you know, Erica asks this question, you know, and I talk about it in the book. I actually talk about all of these things, so go read the book, and you know, whatnot. But Erica, you bring up a very important point, right? Because there are two things that influence the actual practice of the scam. One, for those who have had the experience, as one of the crew members I worked with did, working in the call center, they learned the practices, the protocols of the call center. They knew how to speak to these North American people because they were trained. One of the most growing educational spheres in Jamaica right now is actually call center training, right? It is training, Jamaican, workers to enter into the BPO industry. However, long before BPO shows up, what you have is exactly what you're talking about, right? They understand how, what we might say, to beg. They understand how to, and when I say beg, I'm not talking about actual begging, but in Jamaican parlance, yeah, to beg, I beg you or something, what have you, right? The idea is that they already know how to extract, right, capital from their relations, right? Boy, so school fees have to pay tomorrow, and right, and so they take these abilities into these relationships, and they manipulate these people in very intimate ways. They now know when their victims have to pay for Christmas gifts. They know when their victims have to, buy their medication, or when their Social Security checks come in, just the same way that, impoverished Jamaicans would, track their better off, relatives abroad. And so, but, that then, is then married to what are more formalized skill sets developed out of the call center. All right, Amber.
Thank you so much, Jovan. This has been such a thoughtful and rich discussion, and we are so grateful for your time, as well to Patricia. So I'm going to ask actually if we can draw this to a close, and if people would like to unmute so that we can give Dr. Lewis the round of applause that the work deserves.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to the audience for being so active and the series of excellent and insightful questions. And finally, just to signal that if you are interested in this talk, you may be interested in the next speaker in our series, who will be Professor Stefan Uma, who is going to join us on June 10th. Information will be on our website, and the topic of that paper will be Labor Efficiency Critique, Writing the Plantation into the Present Future. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much, everyone. It's lovely to see you virtually. Thank you.
Thank you. I just quickly dropped my email in the chat. So please, if there are other questions, I see Luke has a question. Please send me an email. Please follow up. I'd appreciate it.
Great.
Patricia,
Thank you.
Amber, thank you so much.
Bye.
Thanks, Jovan. Bye.
Take care.